Within the last week, I got around to watching two great thrillers that cleverly incorporate rather sensitive themes in quite unique ways. One of these has been highly praised for its nuance and originality in the years since its release, while the other is pretty new, but while it got some chatter going upon its release, I haven't noticed any deeper conversations about its ideas, and I don't know if it will have the same impact as time goes on. Interestingly, I found one of these films to be far more thoughtful, intelligent, and delicate exploration of its ideas than the other, and it's not the one their reputations might have you guess. So let's look at these two thematic thrillers to see if we can figure out how to carefully and effectively implement potentially controversial ideas into our stories, to give them an added layer of depth without driving away our audience. But before I get into it, I'm just thinking out loud here, so if you like my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. I'm just here to kick off the discussion, so I hope you join the conversation in the comments. Just so you know, while I won't be giving any major spoilers that will totally ruin the whole movie, I will describe a couple scenes and give away a few little twists, so watch at your own discretion. I also won't be thoroughly examining everything these films have to say. This video isn't a thematic deep dive, it's just looking at how these films approach and communicate their respective themes. So if that's what you're here for, then buckle up and let's get started. First, I watched Jordan Peele's debut film Get Out. This film has earned its director so much attention since its release back in 2017 that I've seen people prematurely count him among the greatest directors of all time. So I've wanted to see what the hype was all about for some time now. Well, I finally got the chance to check it out, and I was, well, underwhelmed. To be clear, for the most part, I liked this movie. Its first two acts could be considered a masterclass in slow-burning tension, using little more than uncomfortable social situations to ratchet up the tension as it becomes clear that all is not as it seems. The third act did lose me a bit, as I felt the big reveal was kinda dumb and it really stopped being scary as the climax devolved into suspenseless action. But I still would have been on board if I felt it lived up to its reputation as a brilliant exploration of its themes of racism and racial identity. Which I didn't. A big part of that was just that I didn't get what it was ultimately trying to say. Now, I'm not black, so maybe it speaks to some part of the black experience I wouldn't be familiar with. But to me, the movie's message was mostly just confusing. Trying to sum up the ideas it presented, all I could come up with is white people are racist, not because they see black people as inferior, but because they're jealous. Which, I don't know, just felt like it was not only painting black people as victims, but simultaneously putting them on a pedestal. To be clear, I'm not trying to put words in Jordan Peele's mouth, and I doubt that was really all he was trying to say, so I did a bit more research than that while trying to understand his intentions with this movie. However, most of it didn't really help, and as I said, this video is not actually about the movie's themes themselves as much as the way it handled them. So to that end, my point still stands that whether or not it has anything more profound to say than what I got from it, it really didn't make a clear point to a wide audience. At least, not an audience wide enough to include me. But beyond the themes themselves not making a whole lot of sense, I didn't think the way they were presented felt particularly balanced or complex. However, I'll come back to this point once I sum up the other film I saw last week. Believe me, I didn't make this video primarily to trash on Get Out. It was a decent enough movie, and I didn't even start thinking much about it until after I'd watched Companion and started drawing comparisons. Get Out and Companion were surprisingly similar movies in a lot of ways. Of course, Companion's visual style is way lighter and more upbeat than Get Out's dark and ominous tone, and it's far more comedic, though for that matter, Get Out had far more humor than I expected as well. But both are violent and suspenseful thrillers built around a concept dealing heavily in some loaded themes. While Get Out is obviously a film about racism and race identity, Companion is a film about misogyny and abuse, an aspect of the film surprisingly absent from most of the commentary I've seen about it. While I won't spend long diving into its themes, I will just say that I found its use of companion robots to explore not just objectification, but also the meaning of love itself and how love can be used to manipulate people and keep them in abusive relationships, to be absolutely fascinating and surprisingly applicable to human relationships in the real world. To give you a glimpse into my life, I'm studying family sciences with the goal to be a therapist. I'm no expert on anything yet, as I'm just starting out on this journey, but so much of what was presented in this bloody sci-fi comedy thriller about robots was so easy to analyze through the lens of relationship therapy and resonated so deeply on so many levels. And potentially best of all, it did so without ever feeling even slightly pretentious. See, Get Out was clearly trying to be smart, but while it gave me the superficial feeling of watching a highly intellectual film, I didn't actually take anything away from it. Meanwhile, I think Companion has largely avoided the attention it deserves because it presents itself as little more than a funny and occasionally gory thriller. It just feels like it wants to be a fun time, but if you don't entirely turn your brain off, this film is surprisingly deep. Now for the real reason I wanted to make this video. How does Companion present its message with so much more nuance than Get Out? Well, since both films are generally about the oppression or mistreatment of one group by another, whether that's by race or gender, how do each films depict those groups? First, let's look at Get Out. Here, black people are the victims and white people are the oppressors. That in itself isn't a problem, as it's the whole point. But is there any nuance to how each group is depicted? Do we see good people and bad people among each group? Not really. All the black people in the film are victims or heroes, and all the white people we see, if they don't turn out to be totally evil nutjobs, are simply bigots. Am I offended by that? No, I don't feel like this was an attack against all white people, just rich white people. But yeah, we don't get a variety of perspectives or motives from different characters in the film, nor does anyone but the black protagonists come off as remotely sympathetic. Which, to be fair, isn't necessary for a good thriller, and kinda makes sense given the plot, with the main character trapped and surrounded by a cabal of psychos for most of the runtime, but it does hold the movie back from feeling like a particularly compelling exploration of its themes. Now what about Companion? Well, unlike in Get Out, every single character in Companion is dramatically different, and offers a unique perspective on the ideas it's exploring. First, let's look at Josh, who is essentially the villain of the movie. Interestingly, he is far from the stereotypical Chad type you picture when you think of misogynists, showing that it's not just big, rich, tough guys like Sergei who are capable of objectification and abuse. Josh is an insecure, average guy who feels he has no control over his lot in life, and thus exercises all the control he can over the one person he can control, a robot built to do whatever he wants, whose programmed feelings for him, which she can't help, he weaponizes to manipulate her. That's what toxic relationships most often look like. But it's not just the men in this movie who suck. I really appreciated the character of Kat, who shows that not all women are innocent victims in abusive relationships. Unlike Iris, she knowingly allows herself to be abused and objectified so she can manipulate men like Sergei for her own gain. Plenty of women in the real world are totally complicit in misogyny because they accept it as part of the world and can use it to their advantage, and they can be just as petty and manipulative as the men they exploit. And according to Josh, it seems women like Kat are the reason he feels his need for control and turned to Iris for companionship in the first place, suggesting neither men nor women are totally innocent of this system of manipulation and abuse. Kat's role in the story alone is enough to add several more layers of complexity to its themes than Get Out could ever have. Of course, not everyone in this movie totally sucks. I thought Eli and Patrick were an interesting part of the story because they offer a more positive perspective on the whole companion-robot relationship dynamic, making you wonder if love can really be genuine if it's just the result of programming, and if that's any different from real love. It was nice to see a relationship in this movie that shows genuine mutual trust and affection is very much real and possible, that love isn't just a tool of manipulation. Even if, A, it seems like the gay relationships are always by far the healthiest in these kinds of movies, which is starting to get cliche, and is not necessarily what I tend to see in reality, and B, I have serious issues with people claiming to have genuine relationships with companion bots in the real world, where AI is not sentient, as it seems to be in this movie. So I have a tough time not being a little uncomfortable with the idea of this relationship, in case it's trying to make the real-world equivalent look healthy. But moving on from the main characters, I find that the way minor side characters are depicted tends to be pretty indicative of how nuanced the film's discussion is. And for whatever reason, it seems cops most often get used to make cheap shots at whoever the movie might want to vilify. And guess what? Each of these movies has a scene with a cop, and comparing these two scenes was the start of the idea for this whole video. In Get Out, there's a brief scene where they talk to the police that serves no other purpose in the movie other than to demonstrate racism by having the cop giving the main character a bit of a hard time for no apparent reason other than his skin color. To the scene's credit, the cop in question isn't obnoxious or belligerent. He's very professional as far as movie cops go, but this entire scene does absolutely nothing for the story, other than to remind us that cops are racist. And look, I'm not saying that unfair racial profiling isn't a common occurrence, just that the scene made it clear that the movie was going out of its way to demonstrate racism at every chance it could. So, what about the cop and companion? Well, they could easily have made him cartoonishly misogynistic towards Iris, and it would have felt totally in line with the movie's narrative. But guess what? The movie is not worried about pushing a narrative or vilifying any large group of people. So the cop in this movie is super polite to this seemingly foreign girl in distress as he tries to help her out however he can. He's clearly just doing his job, and he's genuinely nice about it until he has reason to think she's dangerous, at which point he handles the situation like any well-trained officer would do. These scenes and characters are both pretty minor in their respective movies, but I think they do a lot to highlight the difference between them. One scene just exists to point a finger at an easy target without pointing out anything interesting, while the other just serves its story without unnecessarily vilifying anyone. One film is clearly going out of its way to make a point, while the other is just trying to tell a good story. And ironically, it's the second whose message feels far more compelling because it actually uses a complex set of unique and often decent characters to explore its ideas, rather than just relying on a bunch of shallow caricatures to say something we've all heard 100 times before. Again, I didn't think Get Out was a bad film. I just don't get why it's been praised so heavily for the last 8 years for its supposed thematic complexity. Just making racism the subject of your thriller doesn't automatically make it deep. You've got to put in more work than that if you want your audience to actually be left with something to think about. I think Companion deserves far more praise than it's gotten on that front, because whether or not it was the movie's main intention, it did put in that work. So what do you think? Which of these movies do you like more? What do you find most interesting about either of them? Do you have anything to add to my comparison? I'm particularly interested to hear if you think I missed what people love so much about Get Out. If you have any insight into its themes, please share them in the comments. I'd love to be able to appreciate this movie as much as everyone else. Again, I'm just here to kick off the conversation, so I look forward to joining you in the comments below. Until next time, never stay silent.